While I'm waiting, just to remind you that we have an e-zine. Some of you, or hopefully many of you, are already subscribers to it. It comes out about every 2 months. And if you don't already subscribe, I really would encourage you to do so, as it'll keep you up to date on the latest developments, new guidance, events that we're holding, webinars such as this, and as I say, you can subscribe through our website. Okay, I'm just giving another few seconds and then we kick off. I'm conscious some people are probably on their lunch break at this point in time. Okay, I think we'll start. Just to say before I hand over to Mandy Osborne, our research manager, this webinar is being recorded and we will have a recording up on our website after the event in probably a couple of days. We also will share the slides with everybody who is registered. So by all means, if you want, keep notes, but these slides will be available. And again, they will go up onto our website, where we will also publish the report. The report itself will go up about 2 o'clock today. And the slides and the recording will be available after that. Captions are available if you just want to turn on the button on the toolbar. We will also take questions. We'll take questions through the Q&A button. Again, if you look at the bottom of the screen, you'll see the toolbar there. We have a team available to answer them where we can during the webinar if they're on relevant issues. But we'll also have some time at the very end with Mandy, where Mandy will answer the specific questions relating to today's event. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome you all and hand you over to Mandy Osborne, who's our research manager, to take you through her analysis of the annual reports for 2019 to 2022. Over to you, Mandy.
Hello everyone, and thanks Geraldine there for that introduction. It's great that so many of you were able to join us today, and hopefully you'll find the presentation interesting. And as mentioned earlier, if you have any questions, just pop them in and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can before we finish up. So looking firstly at the data that we analysed for the report. Here we go. Okay, so in total there are just over 11,500 charities on the register of charities, and this is made up of just over 7,800 charities and around 3,700 schools. All charities are legally required to submit an annual report to the charities regulator, providing information on their finances and their activities. This is due within 10 months of their respective financial year end. So charities with the year end of the 31st of December 2022, for example, which is the bulk of charities, had to submit their report before the 31st of October 2023. And although we are now halfway through 2024 almost, the most up-to-date full-year charity data we have relates to 2022. I'm going to take an opportunity now to remind charity trustees that filing an annual report on time is not optional. It is the law, and responsibility rests with the trustees to ensure that their charity is compliant. Failure to file an annual report on time is an offence under the Charities Act. Yet despite this, a significant number of charities still don't file within 10 months of their year end. We know from our research that transparency is consistently the most important factor when it comes to improving public trust and confidence in the sector. And given that, and in fairness to those charities that do file on time, over the last year or so, we have adopted a stricter approach to enforcing compliance with this obligation, including a number of recent prosecutions. So to avoid this happening to your charity, please make sure your annual report is filed on time this year and every year. So back to the report anyway. When developing a report like this, the first step is compiling the data set, and that is charities that will be analysed. We don't include schools because their financing and government arrangements do not reflect the wider charity sector. And we also generally remove private charitable trusts, again, because they're not representative of the sector. We then remove the Health Service Executive, and many will be surprised to find that it's the largest registered charity with income in excess of 24 billion in 2022, or more than the rest of the sector put together, and over 140,000 employees. So you can see how including it in the data would skew it. However, we do include funds and grants received by other charities from the HSE. We then applied a number of criteria to further refine the data set to ensure that we were comparing like with like year on year. This included ensuring that every charity in the sample had filed an annual report for each of the last 4 consecutive years, and that the annual reports cover the same financial period, that is the 1st of January to the 31st of December, which is the most common. When these criteria were applied to all non-school charities, a total sample of 3,147 charities were identified and extracted for analysis. And the sample equates to around 40% of non-school registered charity and is representative of the register in terms of size, structure, legal form, and so on. So today I'm going to just go through various parts of the report, including a closer look at income and income sources, expenditure, volunteering and employment, and what the data and information submitted by this large representative sample of charities in their annual report tells us about the sector over the last 4 years. So firstly, looking at charity income. Overall income in charities in the sample rose by over 23% in 4 years between 2019 and 2022, rising from 11.2 to 13.9 billion. However, it is important to note that these increases are not spread evenly across the sector, and some charities have experienced a decrease in income over the last 4 years, particularly smaller charities not in receipt of any public funding, but more about that later. When averaged over the 4 years, just over half of the charities in the sample reported income of less than 250,000 per annum, with almost 1 in 5 charities reporting income of less than 25,000. So they really are very small. However, when we compare the number of charities falling into each income band in 2022 with 2019, there are now fewer charities at this lower end of the income scale, down 5%. So looking at the sample as a whole, charities have grown in terms of income over the last 4 years, despite the challenges. However, as already noted, not every charity has had the same experience. So going back now to income growth. Income growth is particularly evident at the top end of the income scale, where there has been a rise of almost 12% in the number of charities reporting income in excess of 50 million, although overall numbers are still small when compared to the sample and the sector as a whole, with just 48 charities falling into this over 50 million band. However, although the number of them is low, the top 10 of these very large charities alone account for over 40% of all charity income, with the majority of them operating in the education or healthcare area. Income from the public purse, that is from government departments, local authorities and other public bodies such as the HSE and Pobl, is the largest source of funding reported by charities and accounts for over 3/4 of all charity income, or 10.6 billion in 2022. When averaged per charity, the increase in government or local authority funding between 2019 and 22 was close to 25%, with funding from other public bodies increasing by over 4%. The number of charities in receipt of public funding has risen to up 8% since 2019. While income from the public purse has increased every year since 2019, income from commercial and trading activities saw a sharp drop between 2019 and 2020, falling by 16% between those 2 years. However, by the end of 2022, income from commercial activities was showing not only a recovery, but an average rise of over 16% from pre-pandemic levels. The greatest level of increase was seen in income from philanthropic organisations, which saw an average rise of over 37% between 2019 and 22. However, this is good news for the charities concerned. Much of this rise can be attributed to several large philanthropic donations made to a very small number of charities, rather than a sector-wide trend. And the amount of funding we're talking about here is low, at less than 1% of overall income in the sector. But there may be encouraging signs in that the number of charities reporting income from philanthropic organisations in 2022 is up 14% compared to 2019. Income from donations and bequests fell on average by around 4.5% in 2020, but has since picked up, and by the end of 2022 was up over 5% on pre-pandemic levels. However, there have been some notable changes in the sources of donations, which we'll cover next. So when a charity indicates in its annual report that it has income from donations, it is then asked to select the sources of those donations from a drop-down list of 16 options. An analysis of the number of mentions of each source shows significant fluctuations over the last 4 years, and this can be seen by the 4 colours at the various headings in the chart. This is not surprising given the tight restrictions on retail and public gatherings which were in place in the early months of the pandemic, and some of which continued right into 2021. In this period, there was a significant decrease in mentions of the types of income which rely on personal interactions, while there is an increase in those which are or can be carried out remotely. And we'll just look at these in a little bit more detail. So on this slide, I've just included a few of the sources which had significantly increased numbers of mentions in 2022 compared to 2019. Campaigns saw the greatest increase, up over 39% on 2019. Donations from volunteers, members and staff was up over 31%, and it was the only source out of the 16 options which consistently rose year on year over the 4 years. Every other source fluctuated up and down. Also on the rise are mentions of philanthropic sources, up over 22%, direct marketing appeals up over 20%, and non-cash collections up almost 19%. Other mentioned sources on the increase include corporate donations and donations of services, both up around 9%, and fees for services up just over 3%, perhaps an indication that more charities are seeing a need to charge for some or all of their services. By 2022, some of the in-person sources had returned to or were exceeding pre-pandemic levels. However, there are a couple of exceptions, which, although showing some recovery since 2021, are still down on 2019 figures. The most notable of these are draws and lotteries, which in 2022 is up 28% on 21, but was still down 17% on 2019. Fundraising events, which are low up over 7% since 2021, is still down 15% on 2019. And sponsorship, which is up slightly since 2021, is still showing a drop of 13% on 2019. These, particularly fundraising events and sponsorship, were undoubtedly impacted by some hesitancy in resuming in-person contact as we emerge from the pandemic. And it'll be interesting to see what trends emerge when we start to analyse the 2023 annual reports early next year. Although the number of charities mentioning cash collections in the reports is showing some recovery, it is still down over 6% on 2019. And some of this can likely be attributed to the general decline in the use of cash and the rise in more online and electronic financial transactions, which gathered momentum during the pandemic. And this correlates with the figures for the increases in non-cash collections, which we saw earlier. This move away from cash is also reflected in the survey we conducted last year of the public's intentions to donate to charities at Christmas. Over a quarter of respondents who intended to donate said they would only donate online, and 17% would only donate to an on-street charity collection if they were offered an option to tap with a card or phone. Both responses were highest amongst those aged 18 to 34. So that's definitely something to take into consideration as you develop fundraising plans for the future. As we noted earlier, overall income reported by the charities in the sample was up 23.7% since 2019. So let's see how different groups of charities fared over the last 4 years. Charities with employees, first of all, saw their income rise 23.8% since 2019, just above the overall average. However, volunteer-only charities, and that is charities with no employees, which make up almost a third of the sample, saw a lesser increase, coming in at 19.5%. 1 in 5 charities are funded solely or primarily by public money. And what we mean there is that 90% or more of their income comes from government, local authorities, or other public bodies. These charities saw their income rise by almost 17% since 2019. And the number of charities falling into this cohort is also on the increase, up by 12% since 2019. So it appears that more charities are now relying on public funding to deliver their services. On the other side of the coin, just under a third of charities do not receive any public funding at all. And looking at them overall, they have had a very different experience over the last 4 years. This group is made up of mainly volunteer-only charities towards the lower end of the income scale, and they saw their average income fall by 37% between 2019 and 21. And the low average income recovered somewhat in 2022. It is still down 13% in 2019 figures. So looking now at income by charitable purpose, and charitable purposes are set out in the Charities Act, and essentially it is the overarching aim of a charity and what its activities work towards achieving. For example, the advancement of education or the relief of poverty or economic hardship. Around half of charities have a single charitable purpose, and we will only be looking at these because if a charity has multiple purposes, we cannot tell what amount is allocated to which purpose. So therefore, when it comes to analysing data like this, it limits us to single-purpose charities, but more on that in a moment. So although the data only relates to half the sample, there are a number of points of interest. Income rose across all charitable purposes over the 4 years, with the exception of the advancement of religion, which has fallen every year, and is down over 24% from 2019 levels. And the promotion of religious or racial harmony, which rose in 2022, but is still down over 10% in 2019. Income in the very few charities with the charitable purpose of the protection of the natural environment and the advancement of environmental sustainability saw the greatest increases and have risen significantly every year over the last 4 years. But given that the number of charities with this purpose is small and income levels are at the lower end of the income scale, the monetary value of the increases we're talking about here are relatively small in comparison to the sector. As I've just mentioned, analysing data for multiple purpose charities can be problematic, but even if it was more straightforward to use, it would still provide very limited insight into the sector, because charitable purpose by nature are very broad, and so don't show the breadth and sheer diversity of the types of activities being carried out. It would be really useful if we could easily extract data for charities working with children or young people, for example, or working overseas, or providing residential mental health services, and analyse that in isolation to produce in-depth reports like this one for any one of those specific types of charities. Excuse me. Charity classification will allow us to do just that, but that can't happen until most charities choose their classification on the register. This will greatly assist researchers and other organisations. It will help guide donors, funders, policymakers and charities themselves to easily identify charities based on more meaningful descriptions of their actual activities than charitable purposes alone can give. So if you haven't done so already, I would really encourage the trustees of all charities to take time at their next meeting to discuss and agree the classification for their charity. Then log into my account and complete and submit the online classification form. It's a simple form, it'll only take a couple of minutes to complete, and it only needs to be done and submitted once, unless the charity changes focus and direction in the future. Full details of the classification standard and related guidance is available on our website. So moving on from that unashamed plug for classification, let's move on now to charity expenditure. The annual report form currently requires charities to provide figures for total expenditure and to break that down into expenditure on salaries and wages and other expenditure. Total expenditure, as reported by the charities in the sample, has risen steadily year on year, showing an overall increase of over 25% by the end of 2022, rising from 10.9 billion in 2019 to 13.8 billion in 2022. Non-salary expenditure, or other expenditure as it was referred to in the annual report, is up almost 28% on 2019, rising from 5.8 billion to 7.4 billion. Non-salary expenditure is made up of direct spending on charitable activities, programme costs, and any support costs which are necessary for the charity to be able to operate and carry out these activities. Support costs will differ from charity to charity, but could include, for example, day-to-day running costs such as rent of premises and insurance, office administration, consultancy or professional fees, or the purchase of goods for resales, or capital costs such as building construction or refurbishment. We can't tell from the data in the annual report how the non-salary expenditure was spent, and therefore how much of the increase was in expenses was directly related to charitable activities and how much was in day-to-day running costs and capital costs and so on. However, undoubtedly the rise in costs of goods and services, not least in utilities, which we have all experienced over the last couple of years, has had an impact. And we know from our last charity survey, which was carried out at the end of 2022, that more than half of charities surveyed cited rising costs as their greatest challenge, surpassing securing funding, which had been the main challenge when the previous survey was conducted back in late 2020. So although expenditure on salaries is up over 23%, rising from 5.2 billion in 2019 to 6.5 billion in 2022, and accounts for almost half of all charity expenditure, as a percentage of overall expenditure, it has fallen slightly over the 4 years, down 1.8% on 2019. But I think it's important here to note that many charities can only achieve what they're set up to do by employing staff to deliver their services or activities. And there are a couple of points about how salary expenditure and employee numbers too, which we'll look at next, are reported on by charities in their annual report, which need to be taken into consideration by anyone looking at the data. Firstly, salary expenditure includes the total staff costs, for example, employers' PRSI, pension contributions, overtime payments and shift allowances. Salary expenditure also does not reflect the actual hours worked by any employee or any details about their role. And finally, the number of employees submitted by a charity relates only to those employed by the charity and working in Ireland, whereas salary expenditure includes all of those employed by the charity regardless of where they are working. So it is because of these complexities that we don't include any average salary calculations in the report. So looking at employment, when it comes to employment and charity, overall the number of charities reporting employees has remained static at 67%, or 2,124 charities in the sample reporting that they had employees in 2022, an increase of just 2 charities in 2019. Since 2021, charities have had to provide the average number of full-time and part-time employees rather than in bands as previously, which gives us much more accurate figures for the number of employees than we had before. So I'm only going to look at 2021 and 2022. When we compared the 2 years, we find that overall average numbers of employees reported rose by 0.3% in the 2 years. However, as with any average, there were extremes. Charities with income of between 10 million and 50 million euro saw an increase in employee numbers of almost 11%, while charities at the lower end of the income scale, that is below 250,000, saw the numbers employed fall by 7%. The total number of employees reported in 2022 by the charities in the sample is just over 137,000, with almost 2/3 employed on a full-time basis. Smaller charities have a much higher smaller charities have a much higher proportion of part-time staff than the largest charities. 63% of charity staff in charities with income of under 250,000 are part-time, compared to 29% in charities with income over 50 million. And just under 1 in 10 employees work in charities with income of less than 1 million. In contrast, over half of charity employees work in charities with income in excess of 50 million. So what about volunteering? Well, looking at charity trustees first, these are the people who ultimately exercise control over and are legally responsible for a charity. And charity trustees may also be known as directors if the charity is a company, the board, or committee members. There are just over 18,500 charity trustees in the charities in the sample, averaging at 6 trustees per charity. While we didn't specifically analyse trustee data for this report because it doesn't form part of the charity annual report, we have looked at this in some of our other research, and we find that smaller charities, that is those with income of less than 100,000, are much more likely to have fewer trustees. They have an average of 5 per charity, compared to 9 per charity in charities with income of over 1 million. Trustees in smaller charities are also more likely to have a longer tenure than larger charities. In the region of half of smaller charities have trustees in place longer than the recommended 9-year maximum, compared to 30% of larger charities. Recruiting and retraining trustees is a challenge for all charities, with 38% of charities in our most recent survey citing it as one of their greatest challenges. While we have published guidance on succession planning and a number of support organisations such as Board Match and Volunteer Ireland can assist in this area, we find that in our public survey that 8 in 10 respondents have never considered becoming a charity trustee. While time commitment was the greatest barrier for most of those who had thought about it but decided against it, a quarter said the reason they had decided against it was because they didn't know enough about what it would involve, while a further 15% said that they didn't know how to go about becoming a trustee. So there are people out there who would potentially come on board if they knew more. So increasing awareness and providing better information about what is involved in being a charity trustee is something for us all to work on. Moving on now to levels of volunteering other than trustees. Nearly a quarter of the sample of charities reported no volunteers, and of the charities with volunteers, 46% had fewer than 10 volunteers in 2022. Before I go on to numbers of volunteers, it should be noted that charities report the number of volunteers in bands in their annual report, and that these estimates are based on taking the midpoint of each band multiplied by the number of charities falling into the band. So they really are rough estimates. Based on the annual reports filed by the sample charities, it is estimated that there were around 210,000 volunteers in 2022, up from an estimate of 195,000 in 2021 in these charities. However, volunteer numbers are likely to have been impacted due to the pandemic right through 2021 and into 2022, as some charities weren't able to operate or were operating at reduced level for long periods, while others may have had many more volunteers than they would have in normal times. The estimated number of volunteers in 2019 was almost 237,000. However, this figure must be considered with caution, as some charities will have included their trustees in their volunteer count on the online report form, and it's only since 2021 that trustees have been specifically excluded on the form. We analysed volunteer numbers relative to income across all income bands in a report on Ireland's smaller charities, which we published late last year, and we found that smaller charities have significantly more volunteers relative to their income than larger charities. Charities with income of less than 100,000 have 7.4 volunteers for every 10,000 euro of income. Charities in the 100,000 to 250,000 bracket have 2.3 volunteers for every 10,000 of income. And charities with income in excess of 10 million have just 0.1 volunteers for every 10,000 euro of income. So just to comment now about the accuracy of charity annual reports. They are published on the public register and are an extremely valuable source of information for donors and the general public, as well as for policymakers and researchers. Charity trustees are responsible for ensuring that the data and other information provided in the annual report is accurate, even if someone else submits the report on their behalf. And it is really important that every charity files an accurate annual report, because an error might have a negative knock-on effect when someone is looking at the charity on the register, and they certainly have a cumulative effect for those of us analysing the data as a whole. We do not routinely verify annual reports, but we know from our work that there are sometimes errors in what is submitted by individual charities. And I'm talking here about significant errors, not the odd euro here and there, such as you can get when rounding figures. I've included a couple of more extreme examples in the next couple of slides, but I'm not going to embarrass any of these charities by naming them, but these are real errors and the charities have been notified. In this first example, the charity in question reported that it had 1,800 employees, but only €1 in expenditure. And this charity had the opposite problem. They reported just one employee, but salary expenditure of over 15 million. Now I know which one of these two examples I'd rather work for if given the choice. And just a couple more examples here. Charity 3 had a massive income in 2021, totaling more than the whole sector put together. And this screenshot is taken directly from the public-facing register. So this is what the public see. Media, a donor, or anyone else interested in this charity are going to see. Finally, charity number 4 didn't report any expenditure except salaries. So I think these few examples demonstrate just how important accuracy is. And these charities and around a dozen more with significant errors in their annual reports were removed from the sample set for this data report before I carried out any analysis. But this kind of exercise shouldn't be necessary. And more importantly, I know the kind of errors to watch out for. But a potential donor or funder looking at your charity's entry on the public register might not realise that something is an error, and this could influence their decision about supporting your charity. So I just ask you, or whoever completes the online report on behalf of your charity, please take a minute to sense check your annual report before you hit the submit button, because the online form won't analyse the figures and flag these kind of errors when you're filling it in. And if you do spot a significant error in the report that you've already filed, please let us know, and we will return the submission to you for amendment and resubmission. I think having an accurate register is in all of our interests. So just to summarise as I move towards the end of the presentation, although this report doesn't include data from all registered charities in Ireland, it was from a large and very representative sample. And it is really encouraging to note that many charities appear to have weathered the significant impact that the COVID pandemic had on society. However, challenges remain, and this is borne by the data, including income across the sector has increased year on year since 2019, up 23.7%, but non-salary expenditure has risen by 27.8% in the same period. Reliance on the public purse as the sole or main funding source is increasing, with the number of charities in this cohort rising by 12% over the 4 years. Charities which do not receive any public funding have seen their income fall by 13% over the 4 years, and employment levels have remained relatively static. However, salary expenditure increased by over 11% between 2021 and 2022 alone. Despite these challenges and many more besides, charities continue to step up, making a real difference to the lives of individuals and communities, both in Ireland and beyond. For the vast majority of charities, this can only happen because of the continued generosity, trust and confidence of the public, and this is borne out in the analysis. Over 6 in 10 charities reported that they received donations or bequests, with 8%, that's almost 1 in 10 charities reporting them as their only source of income. In terms of volunteers, 76% of charities reported that they have volunteers, and nearly 1/3 are volunteer only and that they have no employees. It is estimated that in 2022, over 200,000 people volunteered with the charities in sample, not including those who generously volunteer as charity trustees. So thank you for your time and attention. I hope you found something of interest in the webinar today. I know I rushed through and there's a lot of stats in there. The full report will be published on our website later this afternoon, and you'll find all of our previous reports and surveys there that I've mentioned. You'll find them there too. And just to keep an eye out, excuse me, for any new reports and publications, we'll flag those in our e-zine and on the website as well. And I'm just going to pass you back now to Geraldine, who's coordinating some of your questions.
So I will allow Amanda to take a good sip of water.
Absolutely.
A well-deserved sip of water. Just to say, I know there were people coming in over the last half an hour, so just to say that the slides will be available. We will send them out to everybody who registered for the webinar, and as well as that, we will also have a recording of the webinar, which will go up and just allow us maybe a day or so to get that up. And as Mandy mentioned, the report itself will go up at 2 p.m. I suppose we have some questions coming in, and if you have any questions, please put them into the Q&A tab. I suppose the first one's, Mandy, what really stood out for you in this particular report?
I suppose that the couple of things, a couple of points, the public funding, the increases to that, whether that will continue. I mean, I suppose coming out of the pandemic, there are likely a lot of charities benefited from public funding that maybe previously wouldn't have, for example, the wage subsidy scheme and things like that. And, those ended in 2021 into 2022, but while they continued partly into 2022. So I think it'll really be the 2023 figures before we see if public funding is increasing. But I think as well, I think that the changes to the donation types struck me as well. How, we're seeing in surveys that the public are using cash less and less. We had the impact of, the various lockdowns. Retail was closed, the traditional church gate collections were gone. And there's the move towards more electronic giving methods, and whether that continues as a trend, but definitely it appears to be on the uptick there. So I think that's one to watch for as well.
Okay. Just a couple of questions that have come through. Do you disaggregate charity figures if they are also a state public body? In addition to the HSE, which you mentioned has been taken out, there are charities who are also state public bodies. If included, this would impact staffing and public funded income.
Absolutely. We don't take them out from reports like this. Last year we did a social and economic impact report, and we did remove them for that and put them in as a separate cohort. It's not an easy job to do because there are the obvious ones there that we can pick out, but there are also a lot of bodies that are maybe it's not obvious in their name that they're entirely state funded. So it's something that definitely, hopefully, classification will help with as well, because one of the questions on the classification form is whether your organisation is a state body as opposed to being funded by the state. So I don't know if that answers that question, but no, the answer is no.
Okay. How many of the registered charities, what percentage are single purpose charities?
Around half are single purpose, and the vast majority of those will either be education, religion, or relief of poverty, I think, off the top of my head. The other charities are all multi-purpose, and some of them could have right up to 6 or 8 purposes.
Okay, there's one here, I'll just say it here, is where would a charity find out if they have actually been classified, if somebody's completed their classification?
On the public register. It's included on the first, the charity looks themselves up on the public register. It's on the very first tab of the registration details.
Volunteer, would this also include those occasional helpers where they would help with the street collection once or twice a year?
That's a lovely question. If only it were that simple. No, it's hard to say. Some charities will only include those people who are regular volunteers. Other charities may include all of them in their volunteer count. And it's, I suppose, probably one of the difficulties with the volunteer estimates is that there's no set definition as to what constitutes a volunteer. So, you know, it's all estimated really for that reason, because we can't be clear without proper clarity.
What level of full compliance with the charity SORP did you see from the survey?
Well, SORP is not a requirement yet. It will come in if and when the amendment bill goes through, and obviously we'll be giving charities and ourselves a good lead time before anything's introduced on that. It'll be hard to see what level of detail it'll bring, because a vast number of charities, and most of our charities are small, and they're not going to fall into charity SORP. So, and a lot of larger charities already have charity SORP. So I don't know what the impact will be until we actually see, we're supposed to see what the regulations require, what the revised annual report form will be. But my own feeling is that we'll still keep a very simple annual report form, because the vast majority of charities don't fall into and won't fall into SORP.
I think that'd be a very important point to make, that the annual report form as it stands at the moment is simple and straightforward to fill out, and it asks for basic information about a charity's activities and its finances. And that's certainly something that the principle that we will be maintaining. And if there are any changes that come out from if the bill is enacted, if there are any changes that come about, we will be ensuring that there's plenty of time for them before they are actually implemented, so that we've got time to get our guidance ready for everyone to understand, and the charity sector itself has time. So just to keep simplicity will be key. That's very important to us. And as Mandy said, over half the charities are small charities with low income, and that'll be a key factor as well in terms of the design of the classification form. A question: how do we know what reporting classification we are under, small, medium or large?
Classification doesn't take into account anything to do with your finances. It's purely what your activities are. So you're not small, medium or large. It's literally the same form. When you decide an animal rescue, you put under that classification. You're helping the homeless, you under that classification. Nothing else. It's literally what your activities on the ground are, how you're furthering your charitable purpose through your activities. So it's much more activity led than charitable purpose and money.
Do you expect ESG reporting to form part of the annual report in the near future? That's probably not a question for us, to be honest. It's beyond our pay grade. No, I mean, it's a very valid question, but it's not something that would be decided by Mandy and ourselves. That will be a wider decision, but it is a very interesting question, and one that comes up a lot. Are trustees registered as volunteers on charity returns?
No, we since 2021, I think it was, we indicated that we don't want the trustees to be included, and we did see a drop in the number of charities reporting that they had volunteers after that, whereas obviously all charities have volunteers because of trustees, but there was a slight drop. So they're not to be included in the figure of the volunteers. They're separate, and we can extract that data separately, so we don't need it in the annual report.
Are there any particular findings in relation to charities self-declaration in relation to compliance with the Charities Governance Code? We didn't look at that.
We didn't look at that for this report, no.
I think that's it. If anybody has any other questions, I have a few seconds to get them through, but I think we've gone through them, so I'm just having a quick look down through here. I think that's it. Thank you all very much for joining us today. Before we finish up, I've got two plugs. One, we are committed in the charity regulator to providing quality data for the charity sector, and for others interested in the sector, that should be donors, the public funders or whatever. And while we can analyse the information, when we can analyse the sector by charity classification, we will be able to provide a wider range of information. So again, just to reiterate Mandy's request, we're asking charities that haven't completed their classification to do so on the register. And if you want to know, if you're curious as to know whether your charity has completed it, you can simply go onto your charity's record on the register and you'll see it there. And if it's not there, we haven't received the information to put on the register. I'd also put a plug in for our e-zine. As I mentioned at the very beginning, we publish it about every 2 months, and we would ask you to subscribe to that for latest developments and news, etc., about the charities regulator. And you'll find details about charity classification and about how to subscribe to our e-zine up on the website. So again, thank you very much for joining us today, and thank you to Mandy for all the hard work that she's put into preparing the report and also preparing for today's webinar, and we look forward to seeing you all again soon. Thank you.